Hey fearsome friends. Now we all have anxieties about our home safety. We ourselves experienced such a thing 8 years ago. Where we live, break-ins can be rife. Each house surrounding ours has been broken into at one time or another. And one night back in 2011, we woke up to seeing some bright light coming through the bedroom window. It was 4 a.m. and there were people shining flashlights onto our property who we think were casing out our house. We got cameras and alarms the next day, and have thankfully had nothing happen. However, the people in the stories I'm about to read weren't as lucky. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. This happened in mid-late 2019, when I was living on my own for the first time in London. I know the city well, so I've never had anxieties about it. The spots people think are dangerous are basically the same as everywhere else. Just keep to yourself and your wits about you, and you're usually fine. The flat I was in the middle floor of a 3-story building. I was renting my flat from a landlord in Argentina, but some of the flats in the terrace were council-owned, so when the windows needed changing, it was a council job. This obviously meant it was going to be prolonged for a ridiculous amount of time, when it could have been done in just a couple of days. They put scaffolding up, and I think it was there for 5 or 6 months. For most of that time, no one was actually doing any work. It was just there. Now, I lived near a police station, and had always been pretty independent and street smart. But this terrified me. I was sitting on my sofa with a bowl of cereal around lunchtime, or mid-afternoon, and was watching TV. The flat had an open-plan kitchen living room, so the kitchen window was opposite me across the room. The living room was on the street side of the building, so I could look out the window and see cars whizzing by, or stoners having a good time. My upstairs neighbour was a very nice guy, but he sold weed from his flat, and it was really irritating sometimes when people rang my bell instead of his at all hours. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a dark shape moving in the kitchen window. My heart instantly started thumping against the walls of my chest, like when you see a shadow in the dark. I think being alone always adds to fear, but I waited a second, keeping my eyes fixed on the TV to see if it would move, and sure enough it did. I could feel my heart practically buzzing, it was going so fast now. I moved my eyes to see what was going on, and turned my head as little and as slowly as possible. Outside my kitchen window was a man. He was dressed all in black. I remember I lived on the middle floor, meaning he'd broken into the back garden and climbed the scaffolding to the platform outside my back window. He was just kind of staring in. I froze. I genuinely couldn't move. I don't know how long I actually sat there for, with my eyes glued to him, but it felt like hours. He got his phone out of his pocket and began angrily, or at least very vigorously, gesturing as he spoke into it. I was convinced he was going to come into my flat. Why the hell would he be there otherwise? The builders weren't due to be back for weeks, and he had no high-vis jacket on or anything. Maybe he'd been hoping the flat would be empty so he could rob me. I had a decent camera and computer that could have been worth the effort, but maybe he'd been hoping that I would be there, for I don't know what. I still couldn't move. I didn't even know where my own phone was. All I was wearing was a t-shirt and my knickers. I was only 19 and alone. Now, I'm not sure how I psyched myself up enough to move, or whether I just disassociated out of fear. But I eventually jolted into my bedroom and put some trousers on and shoes as fast as humanly possible before running to the front door and getting the hell out of my flat. I sat on the curb of the road and phoned my mum and my now ex-boyfriend. He came a few hours later to stay with me to make sure I was safe, and my mum and dad informed the people in charge of the window replacement, and they confirmed that no one was meant to be up there that day. Their only response was to padlock the gate to the back garden, which they'd been leaving unlocked, or just blatantly open. It wasn't directly visible from the entrance to the building, so I'd never even thought to check it was being locked. Most of the time they never even used the padlock, but had the threat of my dad coming after them if anything ever happened again. I felt scared living there for a good while after. But let's just say some much worse stuff that doesn't make for a great story took priority in my head. I do still think about this though, and in my mind he is always just a faceless, shadowy figure. I can't remember his face at all. The story I'm about to tell you was the creepiest encounter that has ever happened to me, and somehow it actually traumatized me. So back in 2017, when I was around 13 or 14 years old, and I was living in an apartment with my parents, they used to work night shifts, so that meant I was alone from 11 p.m. onwards. But what happened one night made my parents change their shift for the daytime. I remember it was summer, and was a very ordinary Tuesday night. My parents said their goodbyes to me, and gave a daily reminder never to open the door if someone came knocking. Also to look through the peephole beforehand to see who it was. I listened intently every time, so they left and I was immediately bored. I decided to watch TV and scroll through my phone, when suddenly I heard knocking at the front door. It was 2 a.m, and I was immediately alert. I was confused though. Who the hell would be knocking at my door at 2 a.m? I thought maybe it was a drunk. So I went to check on it and looked through the door's peephole. And guess what I saw? It was the face of a man making the creepiest smile I'd ever seen. His face was so close to the door, he was leaning on it and still knocking. Of course I screamed in shock. But then, even more terrifying, was that he started to violently turn the doorknob. At one point I thought that the door was going to open, because a crack began to emerge around the frame. He was seemingly enjoying himself too, laughing in this really weird way that words can't even describe. It was kind of like a mix between a clown and a pig, and I thought I was literally going to soil myself. When all of a sudden something inside just snapped, and I screamed at him to stop, or I was calling the cops right then and there. Despite the fact I couldn't get hold of a phone at that moment, as my other hand was pushing the door in case it really did break. Finally the creepy guy stopped trying to get in, then kicked the door, and then there was dead silence, mainly because people were sleeping. After about a half an hour, I checked through the peephole again, and thankfully he'd gone, leaving me with a tired body and traumatized mind. I remember I cried when I called my parents, and they came home immediately. My mum hugged me so tightly, comforted me and slept beside me all night. The other day I asked them about who they thought it might have been, and the answer my parents gave me was quite strange. After the incident, they'd asked the security on the ground floor to check who the guy was that had come in the night before, and he told them that he didn't see anyone come in. Not even the CCTV captured a single person taking the elevator or the stairs. They believed then that it was some kind of prank from the residents who lived in our apartment building. But who exactly? Nobody knows even to this day. Was he living on the same floor as us? I don't know, but I didn't recognize him. I'll never forget it, and maybe next time I shouldn't be so curious. Around 3 years ago, I went to college in a historic, mid-sized city in Florida, and at the time lived in a duplex downtown, maybe 3 blocks from campus. The city is known to be pretty safe, and I lived in a pretty decent area with large historic homes nearby. Here's a little backstory that will become relevant. The duplex I lived in had a front door that locked, and then both the upstairs and downstairs units had their own locking door. I lived downstairs and had 2 roommates, but on this specific night, only one of my roommates was home. We knew the girls that lived upstairs, but only really spoke to them in passing. When they moved in, we emphasized how important it was to us for them to keep the main front door locked, and they did a good job of doing so. So my roommate and I were in for the night, knowing the front door was locked, and smoked a few joints. But at some point we heard a knock at the front door and quickly realized the girls upstairs had ordered a pizza. However, later on, it became evident that they'd never locked the front door after receiving their order. So we finally got to sleep in our own rooms, and since I had a queen bed, I would often sleep with my phone and laptop next to me. A couple of hours after, I fell asleep and woke up to a man standing over my bed. As soon as I realized I wasn't dreaming, I noticed that he was quickly moving my phone and computer off and moving my comforter, trying to get into my bed. I started to ask him who he was, what he was doing there, and I was just generally confused, as I was still slightly high from before, and the only thing he said to me, multiple times, was that he was just trying to get into bed. At this point, I began to panic, as my mind obviously went to the worst. I was hoping that maybe my roommate had invited some random Tinder guy over, and that he had just gone into the wrong room. But the more I questioned him, all he had to say was, "I'm just trying to get into bed." Now, I own pepper spray and a stun gun, but I had accidentally left them on a shelf that the guy was standing in front of, so there was no way I could be able to grab them without escalating the situation. Realizing I needed to do something quickly, I blurted that there were 5 other people who lived in the house, and if he didn't get the hell out now, I was going to scream, and they would all be there within seconds. Luckily, that was all it took to scare him off. I don't know if he had brought something with him, or if he'd stolen something from me, but I saw him grab something in the dark and run out of my room. As soon as he left my room, I shut the door and locked it, and tried to find my phone. I couldn't find it anywhere, but then quickly realized that between my room and the front door is the room of my friend that was home. As scared as I was terrified that the guy had maybe gone into her room, so I grabbed my stun gun and pocket knife, counted to 3, and ripped open my door. I ran into my roommate's room, and she was fast asleep, and there was no evidence of the guy. I told her what had happened, and she asked me if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I began to question myself, until I walked out of the room and saw that our front door was wide open. I went to my room to search for my phone, and finally found it hidden under a pile of clothes across the room from where I had left it. This sent a chill up my spine, as I immediately knew for a fact someone had been in my house and room while I was sleeping, and long enough to hide my phone, which only worsened my suspicions of his intentions. I ran back to my roommate's room, who had at that point believed me, barricaded ourselves into the room, and we called 911. Within minutes, there were police cars swarming our street and yard, and they yelled for us to quickly leave the residence and run towards them. At least a dozen police officers came running in and searched every inch of our apartment and woke up the girls upstairs, searching their apartment to ensure the man had left. The officers then had me write a statement, and I gave them a description of the man, and to this day I've never heard a single thing about the case. I feel incredibly lucky with the outcome of the situation, but the thought of his intentions terrifies me, and additionally the fact that he was never caught scares me even more, as I would hate for anyone to have to go through the pure fear that I did. I will add, there is a chance that he was on drugs or was mentally ill and had no bad intentions, but because he was never caught, I will never know, and my mind will always assume the worst. This happened years ago when I was a college student and lived in an old house with 10 other girls. There were 6 bedrooms, 3 fridges, and it was actually a nice place to live. All of my roommates went home after spring semester, so I was the only stayover during the summer, and as I was working instead of going home, I was alone for a couple of weeks. One night I dragged in after work and was annoyed to discover the doors were unlocked. The landlord had let carpet cleaners in that day. I'd known they were coming, and nobody had locked it up, it seemed. It was well after dark, so I locked the doors and did a glance through to make sure I was actually alone. But as I settled on my bed with a book, trying to relax and forget the house had been open all day, the doorbell rang. I went to the bottom of the stairs, and I could clearly see through the glass door that nobody was actually there. I returned to my room, then the doorbell rang again, but still there was nobody there. While I was still staring at the doorbell rang and rang and rang, until finally I took the batteries out of the bell unit and went back upstairs, now feeling a bit shaken. It was a windy night, and I was hearing rattling, which I tried to ignore, but I already knew I wasn't going to sleep that night. When about 15 minutes later, I heard a footstep on the stairs. It was clearly a heavy, likely male one, and I was alone in the house. The only phone, this was pre-cell phone, was at the top of the stairs, so to call for help I'd have to move closer to the staircase. Now I've heard of fight or flight response before, but I had a reaction I'd never expected. I froze. I couldn't move, as I heard those footsteps get closer and closer. My pepper spray was on my desk, mere feet from me, but I couldn't move. Moments later, a figure dressed in black reached the top of the stairs and turned towards my room. But right before I screamed, I realized it was my boyfriend. He didn't think he'd scare me. He was just having fun. And as our doorbell was a remote, he took it and was hiding in the bushes. Then he came through a downstairs room where the window had been left open in the hot summer, and the screen was easy to take off. That was the last time any of the downstairs windows were left open or unlocked, and the pepper spray and knife made their way close to my bedside. I got him back in a rather immature way, and I told his mum what he'd done. Needless to say, that relationship didn't last much longer. My brother at the time of this story was 21 and played competitive tennis in college. For one tournament, his team went to California, and as kids from the Midwest, they had a lot of fun exploring Cali outside of the tournament. One night, the rest of the team went out, whilst my brother and another player stayed at the Airbnb to study. They were both hoping to go on to med school, so they had to force themselves to exercise self-control and focus on studying. As they were sitting at the dining room table, they suddenly heard a crash in another room, and as the noise was registering in their mind, an incredibly skinny, unkempt short man appeared in the dining room. He started shouting that he was going to kill my brother and his friend, and in shock the duo bolted up the stairs and into a bedroom, and the man was behind them every step, so they couldn't even close the door on him. The pair tried to take the air conditioning unit off the window so they could jump out, but they were unable to do so, and all they had for self-defense was a tennis racket, while the man ranted and raved about how he was going to kill them. They managed to call the police, and the cops arrived within minutes, but it took 5 cops to take down this very small, very skinny man. It seemed like he was on meth or something else, and probably hadn't slept for days. He'd become psychotic, while also developing that superhuman strength that some drugs allegedly cause. He must have seen my brother and his friend through a window, and then threw a rock through it to get in. The team stayed somewhere else that night, and left Cali within 2 days, and I don't even know if charges were filed. This happened several years ago, when I was still in high school. I used to live with my mother and her now husband in a suburban area, in a smallish town not far from a much bigger city. It was relatively safe, probably the safest place I've lived in, and I've experienced insecurity no more than a handful of times. But still, I was taught to be wary of strangers, because no place is totally crime-free. One Saturday night, my mum and her then boyfriend decided to go out dancing. I wasn't very outgoing back then, so staying at home wasn't unusual. She gave me the instructions she used to give me when they went out for several hours, which were: lock the doors, we have our own key so don't open the door to anyone, and clean up after cooking, etc. To give you an idea of the house, it had a front metal fence which was roughly 2 meters high, and there was a metal door at the front of it. Next to it a sliding gate that led to an open-air, roofless garage, and past that garage there was a small porch where the main door was located. To the right there was the adjacent wall to my neighbour, and to the left there was the kitchen, which had a window with bars on the outer side. Parked to a window next to the main door was my mother's bike, which, while not professional, was probably more expensive than the average bike in our neighbourhood. So around 10 p.m. I decided to make some dinner. My schedule usually went wild when I was alone, so I was in the kitchen cutting veggies on the counter and facing the window, when out of nowhere a man came up to the window, and I screamed loudly but briefly, so didn't alert my neighbours. Trembling and very uneasy, I tried to play it as cool as I could. "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I just saw your front door open and thought I'd come in." "What the actual hell?" "The door was never meant to be open," I told him, and asked him what he was doing here. "Oh, I didn't open it, man. It was already open when I saw it. I was just hoping you could spare some clothes or food for me." I wasn't buying any of it, but I guessed I didn't have much choice, since he was already there. Then he pulled up the bottom of his shirt, and I thought I was done, thinking that he had a gun there. "Here," he pointed to his belly. "This is a bullet scar. I was shot while I was robbed. I used to be a thief, but I did my time and have a family. Please, give me something." So he was playing the harmless card. Whatever. I gave him some old clothes of mine. "Anything else? Please, I have a daughter." I gave him $5. "Come on, give me some more," he said. That's when I went inside, pretending to look for stuff to give him, and called the cops. When they came, the front door was still open, as he hadn't even bothered closing it. We later guessed he had come for the bike, since it was just tied with one of those bike chains. But then he saw me and couldn't take the bike just like that, since he had to deal with me calling the cops. I know this is pretty mild compared to some of your stories, but I felt it could have gone a lot worse. So this happened about 2.5 years ago, when my husband, 32, and I, 28, had just bought a secluded home in the heart of suburbia. Our new home is located on an acre of property, surrounded by trees on a dirt cul-de-sac, and it's in a neighbourhood where once the pavement turns to dirt, it's like you're in the country. Our neighbours on either side of us own between 3 and 5 acres, and the neighbours behind us own about 10. It's incredibly quiet aside from nature sounds, and in the summer you can hear the outdoor gun range and small racetrack that are about a mile from us. Now I work a fairly normal shift, 8:30 a.m. until 3 or 4 p.m, and my husband wakes up to go to work at 1:50 a.m. Therefore he goes to bed around 6 or 7. About a month after we'd moved in, it was around 10 p.m, and I went out back to make sure that the fire we had earlier that evening was dwindling. We have a metal fire pit with a lid. But as I was walking back to the door wall, I could hear men's voices. I figured it was just the neighbors, until two men with hunting rifles emerged from behind our shed. At first I panicked and wanted to get inside ASAP, so I pulled out my phone just in case and started to dial 911. Then one of them called out to me as I was opening the door and asked me to stop and asked what street I lived on. Between my panic and my Midwestern politeness, I stupidly told him, and they continued to walk closer to me. Our shed is about 50 meters from our house. Still half inside the house, they asked if I'd seen a deer run by. We have a ton of wildlife, as they'd shot one and couldn't find it. I told them no, and that we're in a residential neighborhood where hunting is illegal. They breezed past that and told me the street they lived on and asked how to get there. Now me, in full panic mode, yelled, "This is private property, and you can figure it out." I then ran into the house, making sure all of the doors were locked and the wooden bars were down on the door walls. We now have a fence, a dog, motion lights, and cameras. This is not so much an encounter, but more of a weird and creepy experience that I just had today. I got home an hour ago to find my door unlocked, and what I found when I walked in has me terrified and incredibly confused. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was that my couch had been moved. Now, normally sitting in the living room, the couch has replaced my dining table in the kitchen, and my table is where my couch was. The whole living room had been reorganized and tidied. Blankets folded and pillows fluffed, and some shoes that I'd left in the living room had been moved to a corner or into my room. My laptop was also moved into my bedroom from my living room, and it gets weirder. I had a case of soda that I'd left on the counter, and now all of the cans were in my fridge and a box was recycled. I had left dirty dishes in the sink, and come to find my sink empty and my dishwasher full, and trash around my kitchen and living room was thrown away too. But the weird thing was, nothing was missing. My gaming systems, TVs, computers, music equipment, even my cash was untouched. I think someone is playing a prank on me, but all my friends have denied it. I know this may sound stupid, but I'm honestly so freaked out right now. Someone has entered my house and moved all my stuff around, and I don't know what to do now. I talked to anyone I could think of who knows where I live and could have done this. Family, friends, old roommates. But everyone has denied it. Additionally, everyone I talked to seemed very confused and concerned for my safety. Either I'm overlooking someone is lying, or it was a stranger. My roommate left before me for work yesterday, and was at work till 10:30 p.m. I left for work at 5 p.m. and came home at 9 p.m. to see everything changed. After my roommate had gotten home, we looked around the house more to make super sure nothing was missing and see if we could find any clues. The only thing I could find that was gone was my deodorant. We did find some more weird stuff though that makes it feel more like a prank. A PS4 controller was placed on the top shelf of a kitchen cabinet where we keep chips. Shaving cream from our bathroom was placed on top of a record player in the spare room, and toothpaste was moved from the bathroom counter and tucked away behind some stuff under the sink. We also found a pair of sunglasses neither of us had seen before. Two people in the comments mentioned that this reminded them of Charles Manson's creepy crawlies. I was confused, so I did some research, and that sounds exactly like what happened to me. Literally, one article mentioned instances of couches being switched with dining room tables, and this definitely gave me chills. But myself and a lot of my friends are into stuff like serial killers and crime documentaries, so I wouldn't be surprised if one of my friends knew this fact about Manson and was trying to just mess with me. I checked briefly for listening devices or cameras, but didn't find anything suspicious in light fixtures or cabinets. I didn't check super well though. because I'm also in the middle of finals trying to write a paper, but I can't focus on anything. I've posted more about the experience on other social networks, but no one has admitted to anything. Lots of my friends are throwing around guesses as to who did it, but nothing. I honestly can't tell if anyone is lying, as everyone seems genuinely as confused and/or concerned as me. But some people have mentioned it's definitely possible that someone was trying to mess with me, thinking it was funny, and is now ashamed or embarrassed based on my serious reaction. I personally think I have every right to be freaked out by this, but I'll continue to post anything else that I find out. Now, I own a bungalow in Toronto and live in a less desirable area, you could say, and I rent half of my home to tenants, and I live downstairs. My tenant is a painter and has a painting crew who meets up in the morning in front of the house, and they consist of 3 to 4 vans full of workers. Often these people come to the house after work and drink a few beers, and would also party on the weekends in the front yard, barbecuing and playing music, etc. They'd drink beer only, so as you can imagine, there was always plenty of beer cases full of empties every week, left outside on the patio. So a few months ago, as I was leaving for work after my tenant and his workers had left, I saw a man let himself into the front yard of my house, which is gated and has a typical latch closing. He walked right up to the front porch, helped himself to a whole case of empties, and as he was walking down the porch steps, I saw him as I was backing out of the driveway. I asked him what he was doing and who'd given him the permission to take things off of the front porch. He looked at me, said absolutely nothing, and proceeded to put the case of empty beer back. I told him to get off my property and to not come back, but I came home later and sure enough the case of empties was gone. I shrugged it off and figured living on a main road in between essentially 2 ghettos, it was expected one day or another. I have been living here for 4 years at that point, and seen some weird stuff, trust me. There's a lot of drunks and drug use, and late at night people literally go up and down the street, yelling at themselves. It's nuts. But going back to this day, I got home from work and was taking bags out of my car to bring inside, when I looked down the driveway and saw a man getting dropped off at the end of it. It was a similar-looking guy from earlier, and he'd let himself in and went to the porch. I walked to the front of the house to see what he was doing, because again, I was shocked that anyone would do that so brazenly at 4 p.m. in broad daylight on a weekday. I got to the front as he was leaving, and he closed the gate behind him, like he was living there. I saw empty bottles in his hand, and again asked him what the hell he was doing on my property. He looked at me and just walked away like it was nothing. No shame, almost like I was bothering him, and he just chose not to respond. The driver had driven off once he'd gotten out of the car, and this man literally walked off down the street. I called someone and told them what had happened, because I just froze. Now what makes this even creepier is that a few times I have been in my basement and seen shadows which turned out to be people walking by my kitchen window towards my backyard about halfway down the driveway, so quite a bit from the actual road. I went outside and asked them what the hell they were doing on my property. And twice I've had 2 men together ask me if I have a room for rent, different sets of people, and same race as the ones who have been trespassing in the front, which is Somalian. And this is relevant, because my tenants are Spanish and only mingle with their own kind, and have done for the last 5 years since living there. Never have I seen any other ethnicities except Spanish. So I know they don't want these people, and neither do I. I've never rented a room ever, and I have only had 1 set of tenants since moving there. They moved in the day after my house closed, and have been there ever since. I'm just creeped out and don't know what the hell is going on. Maybe they think my house is a rooming house because of all the people always outside. And because of my tenant's business and the partying, they see free bottles and they're just junkies. I don't know. Creepy as hell. I feel so uncomfortable. In late May, I decided to take a trip to London for a long weekend, and I stayed at an Airbnb for the first time. It was a nice detached house, slightly away from the usual hustle and bustle of busy London roads. The first day was all well and good, and in the morning I left to explore the city. When I came back to the Airbnb, however, I found it weird how the entry lights were on, as I'm always vigilant with turning off lights when leaving. It's almost like muscle memory nowadays, wherever I am. However, I was a bit tipsy that night, and decided to just put the thought to the back of my mind, and I went to bed. The next morning I got up and left to do some more exploring, then came back home in the late evening. But when I stepped through the door, the front lights were on this time. What I did find strange, though, was how the window near the front door had its blinds drawn to the side, when they were previously closed for as long as I had been staying there. As I made my way into the kitchen, I came in to find a half-full glass of cola on the countertop, alongside a dirty dish in the sink. You may think it was mine and I'd just forgotten, but I had cleaned up after cooking breakfast that day, and the remainder of what was in this bowl looked like cereal, which I had not had that morning. I wasn't planning on making excuses, and I always trust my instincts, so I promptly left the premises and contacted my host. He came down rather quickly as I hung around the closest bus stop, and when he got there, we went in together, and I told him that I was concerned someone may have gotten in when I was out. He was thankfully very empathetic and understanding of my concerns, and decided to remotely check the camera footage. Then, whilst rewinding it, he caught sight of a man wearing a backpack entering through the back bathroom window through the garden, then leaving about 2 hours later through the front entry window, which when we checked was still unlocked. Remember how I said it was odd that the blinds were drawn back on that window? Police were called and we both filed our statements, and from what I know, he has since taken that property down from his Airbnb page. It's not been put back on since, and I've not been contacted by police after the initial report either. So honestly, I can't even tell if this guy has been caught or not, or if the host had any further footage of this man coming in and out. I'm just glad I didn't come face to face with him. Who knows what would have happened, and I wonder how long he had been doing this for. On another note, when I was packing to leave, I couldn't find my teddy bear, which I had taken with me, and I strongly believe he'd taken it with him, and I miss that teddy. So to summarize, remember to always trust your instincts. We have the ability to do so for a reason. What I'm about to tell you happened about 5 weeks ago, and my best friend advised me to come on here and tell you everything. Until now, I was still too traumatized, and I didn't really feel ready to share this experience, but now I think it's the right time to do so. My name is Maxime, a French boy name, and I am a student in Paris. A few months ago, I moved into a 30 square meter studio on the top floor of a building in the Paris suburbs. I prefer to be discreet about the exact location, and it's a 2-room apartment, very ordinary. There are almost only families living in the building, and everything is going well. It's usually a very quiet building on a small street with little traffic, perfect for working in a quiet atmosphere. The location is ideal, and in short, was exactly what I needed. So one night, it was a Friday evening in April, I'd finished work at around 9 p.m, and sat down to watch a series I'd been watching. When around midnight I went to bed, but I had insomnia, which was something I rarely had, and looking back I still wonder if it was a premonition or just a coincidence. I don't know exactly what time I fell asleep, but I woke up at about 2 a.m. with a strange feeling. Like when you wake up feeling like you haven't slept a wink when in fact you have. I turned around and saw the trees in the park across the street through the window next to my bed. But I soon realized that I shouldn't be seeing those trees, and my shutters should not be open. The types of shutters are the ones with 2 leaves. You fold them down from the inside to close the shutters, and I close them every night. But at that moment it seemed impossible that I'd forgotten to do it. It might just be a bit of detail, but personally I knew there was something wrong. I started to feel hot and sweaty, so I got up and walked around the studio. But nothing. I opened my window to fold the leaves down and go back to bed, but of course I couldn't sleep. I tried and tried, but I just couldn't. It kept running through my head again and again. Finally, after half an hour, I started to doze off, but I woke up immediately after hearing a thud. At this point, I didn't know if it was my imagination or if it was real, but I barely had time to ask myself that question when I suddenly heard the noises again. They were footsteps, and they were coming from the corridor on my floor. It only lasted a few moments, and then they stopped. Now I knew something was wrong. My studio is the only one on the top floor, so it couldn't have been a neighbor. Someone was in the corridor outside my door at 2 a.m. My heart started beating fast, but I tried to keep calm, trying not to make any noise, and just waited. The minutes passed, but nothing moved, and there was no noise at all. I knew that the person was still in the corridor, because I would have heard them coming down if they had left. After 10 minutes or so, the atmosphere was so heavy, and the silence was so eerie, that I decided to get up as quietly as possible. I tiptoed to my door, hoping to see something through the eyelet, but being only a few centimeters away from it, there was a knock on the door. I froze in the doorway, with someone on the other side, knocking in a very unusual way. It was as if he was knocking with his fingers, one by one, and very quietly. After standing there for a few seconds, I gathered my courage and looked through the eyelet, but I saw nothing. There was no light in the corridor, and I didn't want to make any noise so as to not be spotted. However, after a few moments, I heard a laugh. I could tell by the sound that it was the laughter of a fairly young man. It wasn't a simple giggle, as one might imagine in this situation, but a real laugh bordering on slapstick, as if the man was laughing at me. I could feel all the vice and perversity in it, but it stopped after a few seconds, and at that very moment, I was stunned and paralyzed. When I regained my senses, I quickly moved away from the door, once again trying to be as discreet as possible, and sat silently on a chair to calmly think. I quickly realized the situation I was in and understood what was going on. The man at my door knew I was in the flat, and he was the one who'd opened the shutters from the outside. He'd seen me in my room. I just want to remind you that the studio is on the top floor. By going through the roof, you can access the top of the shutter. It's risky as it requires bending over the void, but I know it can be done. I had done it myself to repair the shutter that had jammed a few weeks after I moved in. I didn't feel much like calling the repairman, so just fixed it myself. So by going through the roof and leaning very slightly over the window, it's very easy to access the top of the leaves from the outside. And still leaning over, you can see part of the room where my bed is. The man must have done the same to open the shutters. And by doing so, he was able to see my room, and at the same time me sleeping. I also remembered that the ladder to the roof was in the corridor on the top floor, and that's where he would have gone to get up there. This was all going through my head in a split second, and I started to shake, and my heartbeat increased. I stopped thinking, picked up my phone and rushed to the bathroom, where I locked myself in to call the police. I explained the situation to the lady on the other end of the line, and she reassured me that she would send a patrol. She asked me to stay in the toilet and wait for the police, and told me that she would stay on the line with me until they arrived. The police car arrived in about 10 minutes, but when they got to the floor, they found nothing. The man must have run off while I was on the phone in the bathroom, so I didn't hear anything. On further investigation, the police discovered that the cupola leading to the roof of the building was still open, which confirmed my theory. The policeman told me that for the moment they could do nothing and invited me to come to the police station that next day to file a complaint. There was no way I was going to spend the rest of the night in my flat, so I called my best friend who lived nearby and went to spend the rest of the night at his place. The next day I went to file a complaint, and an investigation is underway, but the police told me from the start that it would be very difficult to catch him, as it's now been 2 weeks since the incident. I'm still slowly recovering from the shock, and I've got many questions tormenting me. Who was this man? Why did he come to my house and open my shutters? Was it just voyeurism, or did he have other ideas in mind? And above all, what would have happened if I had opened the door? Since then, I've been trying to wrap my head around the fact that I'll probably never get answers to these questions. I'm hesitating to move out, or at least leave for a few weeks to move on. The last 2 weeks have been very complicated from a psychological point of view, and I will remember that night in April 2021 for the rest of my life. This story happened to my mother when she was in her mid-20s, which was some time around 1979 or so, a few years before she married my dad. She was living with a friend in an apartment on a shady street in Jackson, Mississippi, with her roommate who was a musician, and she was out of town for the weekend. She wasn't expected to be back until the next day, which was a Monday, and on the Sunday night, my mum went to bed, when she heard some rattling in the front room. It was followed by the front door being opened, so she immediately thought it was just her roommate coming home. However, seconds went by, and she wondered why her roommate hadn't turned on the light and why she hadn't said, "I'm back." My mum could hear things being moved around in the front room, and that's when she realized she was in desperate trouble. There was one room between her and where this burglar was, and there was a back door behind my mum near the kitchen, but it was always kept locked and she didn't have a key. Being a religious person, she began to pray. Her mind became clear and she thought the best thing to do would be to remain still and quiet. Maybe after he'd gotten the money out of the purses, he would leave. Still praying, my mum snuggled down into the pillow, but was so frightened that she was shaking all over. She opened one eye to see the figure of a tall, dark man coming through the doorway. She knew that he had to be over 6'4", because her fiancé, my dad, was that height, and this guy was taller than that when he came through the door. As he walked towards her in the room, she still thought she should try to remain quiet and pretend to be asleep. He stood at the foot of her bed and looked down at her, tilting his head from side to side, as if trying to see her face. She decided that these were most likely her last few minutes on earth, so she cried out to God and said, "Father, Father, Father," and screamed as loud as she could. When she stopped screaming, she realized that the huge man had walked back out through the front room and out through the front door, closing it behind him. My mum locked the door, turned on the lights, and realized that it was not a dream. Later, she called the police, and she made a report of the incident. It turns out the guy who broke in got less than $10 from her purse. They asked her to identify him through small pictures, which only showed faces, and not having seen his face very clearly, She couldn't identify him, as they all seemed very much alike. She finally chose one of them. The detective had been a teaching assistant at the University of Southern Mississippi, where my mum took classes, so she knew him. He looked rather disappointed at the picture she chose and said, "I wished you chose this man right here," pointing to another man. He is 6'6" tall and was just paroled last week. He lives 2 streets down. How could she have identified him if he was not shown to her in a lineup, but only a small picture of his face? Nothing more came of the incident from the police report, and the next week, my mum read of a similar incident several blocks away. However, the woman didn't survive, and they found her body on the lawn the next day. My mum stayed with another friend for several weeks, even though her roommate was back. She just didn't feel safe there for the time being. Some friends were critical of how she'd handled the incident, some saying, "I don't think I would have screamed," and other stuff like that. One friend said, "Don't you see what happened? When you called out, 'Father, Father,' he thought there was someone else in the house with you, causing him to leave in a hurry." That's the story of how our Heavenly Father protected my mum that night, over 40 years ago. So this happened about 5 years ago, and it was such a terrifying night. My family and I lived in a very rural area during this time, a very small town, and our house was outside of the town by about 15 minutes. Our closest neighbour was about a 7-minute drive away, and our road was pretty overgrown and hard to find, so naturally we didn't get a lot of accidental visitors. It was about 11 at night when my mum, brother and I arrived home from travelling to the bigger city about an hour away, and my dad was on a business trip and hadn't been home for several days. We pulled up to our house. The headlights shone into the yard where we kept an outdoor table, and my heart jumped, because I could see that my bike was on top of the table, which is not where I left it. My mum and brother thought it was weird, but we parked up and got out anyway. It was dark on the porch, and I stumbled on something as we got to the front door. Once the porch light was turned on, we realized that the roofing tiles that had been in boxes were all out, meticulously arranged in different patterns. I got such a cold and uneasy feeling. My mum and brother were very freaked out at this point too, as someone had clearly been there. We opened the front door, and this was when I knew we had to go. I always keep my bedroom door shut, and it was wide open. We all booked it back to the car and called my neighbour, asking if we could come over. As we pulled out of the driveway, our lights illuminated our laundry line, and we could see that my brother's bike was hanging from the wires. We all screamed, and my mum slammed the gas on as we left. When we got to my neighbour's house, we called the police, who showed up and searched our entire property. We also had a barn and a chicken coop, but they didn't find anyone. We spent the night at our neighbour's house anyway and went home the next morning. On returning the next day, we found even more things inside the house. My bedroom door was open, and someone had opened all of my drawers and placed food inside. Cat food in my underwear drawer, and cereal with my pants. They had put canned goods inside the refrigerator and had opened all other cabinet drawers inside the house. Movies had been taken out and rearranged in more patterns like the roof tiles on the porch, and as far as we could tell, nothing had been taken. Our stuff had just been rearranged in a seemingly random way. A few weeks went by and nothing came of it, but we were of course all creeped out, knowing that someone had been into our home and touched our things. It was almost creepier that they hadn't robbed us at all, just been through our belongings. A few months later, we found out who had done it. My dad's friend had been at a no-talking Buddhist retreat for 3 years and had just gotten out. With no phone or email, He had stopped by to see us, and when he found no one home, he for some reason thought it would be funny to do the little rearranging stunt. It still creeps me out to this day, and was a very weird experience. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.